The title is The Map of True Places, and it's from a quote by Melville from Moby Dick, which is describing where Queequeg's home is. And the description, it is not down in any map. True places never are. And that seems to really describe the book, because of course what Z thinks is her home is quite different from what she has always imagined. And she's to find that out as she comes back. In the years when her middle name was Trouble, Z had a habit of stealing boats. Her father never suspected her of any wrongdoing. He let her run free in those early days after her mother's death. He was busy being a pirate reenactor, an odd leap for a man who'd been a literary scholar all his life. But those were desperate times, and they were both weary from constantly carrying their loss, unable to put it down, except in those brief moments when they could throw themselves into something beyond the reach of their memories. In her fantasy world, the one where she could forgive herself for what happened that year, Z liked to think that her father Finch would have been proud of her skills as a thief. In her wildest dreams, she actually pictured him joining her adventure. A huge leap for the professor, but not for the pirate he was quickly becoming. She had a preference for speedboats. Anything that could do over 30 knots was fair game. There was little security back then, and most of the keys, if there were any, were hidden somewhere on the boats themselves, usually in the most obvious place imaginable. The game was simple. She would pick a boat that looked fast and sleek, give herself exactly 5 minutes to break in and get the engine started, and head out of the harbor toward the ocean. Once she passed the confines of Salem, she would open up the engine and point the bow straight out toward Baker's Island. Later that night, she would return the stolen boat. There was only one rule. She could never return a boat to the same mooring from which she had stolen it. It was a good rule, not just because it presented an additional challenge, but also because it was practical. If she put the boat back on the same mooring, she would be much more likely to get caught. Everyone knows that the last thing any good thief should do is revisit the scene of the crime. Usually Z would abandon the boat in one of the public wharfs that lined Salem's waterfront. Often it was the one at the Willows, the first wharf you came to when you entered the harbor. But when the cops started looking for her, she began to leave the boats in other, less obvious places. Sometimes she would jump someone else's mooring, or she would leave a boat in one of the slips at Derby Wharf, which made it easy to get away since she lived so close. Only one time did she mess up and misjudge the fuel level. She was all the way up by Singing Beach in Manchester when the engine died. At first she didn't believe she'd run out of gas, but when she checked the fuel again, her mistake was clear. Fighting the panic that was beginning to overtake her, she tried to come up with a plan. She could easily swim to shore, but if she did, the boat would either drift out to sea or smash against the rocks. For the first time, she was afraid of getting caught. In a strange way, she was grateful that there were no other boats around, no one she could signal for help. Not knowing what else to do, she let the boat drift. She looked up at the moonless sky, the stars brighter than she had ever seen them, their reflections dissolving in the water around her like an effervescent medicine that seemed to dissolve her panic as well. Here, floating along with the current, staring up at the heavens, she knew that everything would be all right. When she looked back down at the horizon to get her bearings, she found she drifted toward shore. A dark outline of something appeared in her peripheral vision, and when she turned to face it, a wharf came into focus, and on the hill beyond it, a darkened house. She grabbed an oar and began to steer the boat toward shore, catching the on-sweep of tide that propelled it broadside toward the wharf. She grabbed the bow line and jumped, slipping and twisting her ankle a little, but keeping the boat from colliding. She tied up, securing bow and stern, and scrambled over the rocks to the beach. Then she made her way up the road toward the train station, limping a bit from her aching ankle, but not really too bad, all things considered. Z wanted to take the train back to Salem, but it was past midnight and the trains had stopped running. She thought about sleeping on the beach. It was a warm night. It would have been safe. But she didn't want to concern her father, who had enough to worry about these days, and she didn't want to be anywhere in the vicinity of Manchester when they found the stolen boat. So she ended up hitchhiking back to Salem. Not a smart thing to do, she thought, as she walked to the Chevy Nova that had stopped about 50 feet ahead of her and was frantically backing up. It was a woman who picked her up, probably mid-40s, slightly overweight, with long hair and blue eyes that glowed with the light of passing cars. At first, the woman said she was only going as far as Beverly, but then she changed her mind and decided to take Z all the way home, because if she didn't, she was afraid that Z would start hitchhiking again and might be picked up by a murderer or a rapist. As they rode down Route 127, the woman told Z every horror story she had ever heard about hitchhiking, and then made Z give her word never to do it again, and Z promised just to shut her up. That's what all the kids say, but they do it anyway, the woman said. Z wanted to tell her that she never hitched, that she wasn't the victim type, and that she had only thumbed a ride tonight to cover a crime she'd committed, grand theft bodo. But she didn't know what other cautionary tale such a confession might unleash, so she kept her mouth shut. As she was getting out of the car, Z turned back to the woman. Instead of saying thank you, she said, in a voice that was straight out of a Saturday morning cartoon show she'd watched when she was a little girl, "Will you be my Bobby?" She had meant it as a joke, but the woman broke down. She just started crying and wouldn't stop. Z told the woman she was kidding. She had her own mother, she said, even though it wasn't true, not anymore. Nothing she could say would stop the woman's tears, and so finally she said what she should have said all along, "Thank you for the ride." Of course, Z hadn't given the woman her real address. She didn't want her getting ideas like maybe going into the house and having a word with Finch. She'd planned to hide in the shadows until the woman drove away, and then to cut through the neighboring yards to get home. But in the end, she just walked straight down the road. The woman was crying too hard to notice where Z went or how she got there. 10 years later, Z was training to become a psychotherapist, having outgrown the middle name Trouble. She saw the woman again in one of the panic groups run by her mentor, Dr. Liz Mattei. The woman didn't remember her, but Z would have known her anywhere, those same translucent blue eyes, still teary. The woman had lost a child, a teenager and a runaway, she said. Her daughter had been diagnosed as bipolar, like Z's mother Maureen, but had refused to keep taking lithium because it made her fat. She'd last been seen hitchhiking on Route 95 heading south, holding a hand-lettered sign that read, New York. It was the winter of 2001, and 10 years since the woman had lost her daughter. The Twin Towers had recently come down. The panic group had grown in size, but its original members had become oddly more calm and helpful to each other, as if their free-floating anxiety had finally taken form, and the rest of the country had begun to feel the kind of terror they'd felt every day for years. For the first time Z could remember, people in the group actually looked at each other. And when the woman talked about her daughter, as she had every week they'd been meeting, the group finally heard her. "The world can change just like that," the woman said. "In the blink of an eye," someone answered. Tissues were passed, and the group cried together for the first time, crying for the girl and for her inevitable loss of innocence, and of course for their own. So that's the prologue. That gives you a bit of an idea, I think. It's not quite as sad as that might indicate. It actually has quite a bit of humor, I think, doesn't it? Yes. Okay. When in doubt, ask there. As I said, I think there's a time in everyone's life when we have to turn around and change direction at the very least. In Z's case, she is ripping up her map and starting again. There was quite a bit of, because her father's a Hawthorne scholar, I got absolutely enthralled with Hawthorne. And of course I grew up, right next to Salem. And we spent many school trips going to the House of Seven Gables. And of course we read The Scarlet Letter and The House of Seven Gables. And loved Hawthorne because he was our guy. But I have a new appreciation as I've been rereading him. And of course reading up on all his history so that I could accurately write Finch's character because he knows so much about Hawthorne. But I got really intrigued by the American Romantics, and particularly the dark Romantic era of literature. Melville and Hawthorne. And Z's mother, Maureen, when she was alive, was a writer. But she was a writer of fairy tales. And not good fairy tales, actually, bad fairy tales. But, and there's one embedded into the middle of the story. And I always say to any other writers who might be here, I wanted her to write a bad fairy tale. I mean, it's entertaining, so don't worry, it's not that bad. But it's hard for a writer to say, I want to write something bad, and actually put it in the middle of the book. So that was very daring of me. I'm just telling you this ahead of time. But anyway, Maureen never finished the fairy tale that is in this book. But what she wanted more than anything in the world was to experience the great love